So, I always start my lectures with this. Occasionally, once in the last 3 years, I did a day's work for a company, Pfizer, that makes smoking cessation medication, but I don't normally work with pharmaceutical industry. Right, so I call this "Why Can't I Just Stop Smoking?" And I'm a GP actually by background, and a lot of my colleagues, GPs, have never smoked, and that they would say, you know, they feel this sense of frustration. Why can't you just stop smoking? It's so obvious that you ought to stop smoking. And in a way, it is a bit of a mystery. In fact, people who smoke and come and join us in our research programs, they often say to me, you know, I don't actually understand it myself. You know, I don't even like smoking anymore, and yet it just seems to have this hold on me. I can't understand where this is coming from. And when you look at it one way, which is this way, it does seem a bit mysterious. So everybody knows, for example, that smoking is bad for them. The statistic I like to use, which I think helps bring this home, is if you give up smoking before the age of about 35, it doesn't really decrease your life expectancy, even if you smoke for 10, 15, 20 years, up to the age of 35. But from that age onwards, for every single day you smoke, you're losing 6 hours of life expectancy for that day of smoking. And people who smoke know this themselves, but when you actually look at it in rating scales and you ask them, how's your health? They actually rate their health like somebody, an average person who's 10 years older than they are right now. And that's what smoking does actually. It takes about 10 years off your life. It doesn't really, you know, there's a period in life when we gradually decline before we die. It's a morbid thought, but that's what's going to happen to most of us. Smoking doesn't really lengthen that period. It doesn't really shorten that period on the average. It's about the same whether you are a smoker or a non-smoker, that period of sort of decline before death, but it comes 10 years earlier.
So that top statistic,
yeah.
What constitutes a day of smoking?
So what, you know, if let's say you're 40 years old and you smoke today, then on average you'll have knocked 6 hours off your life just by smoking today.
Is that based on a number of cigarettes smoked per day?
Yes, so it's based on the average number of cigarettes that people smoke. It's taken from a number of studies, a lot of them done here in Oxford. So Richard Dole's famous study of British doctors, Val Beryl's recent study called the Million Women Study also shows that even today, even though people are now smoking fewer cigarettes than they did in Richard Dole's time. Right, and as I said, most people who smoke don't actually enjoy smoking, that's what they say, and they want and try to stop many times, and yet they carry on. So that's why it's a mystery in some ways, and I want to try and talk to you about that mystery and help explain what might be going on. And if we look at what's going on in this, we start by looking at the brain, and we're looking especially at this bit of the brain. What happens when you smoke a cigarette? You inhale the gas, and it's the tar that carries a thing called nicotine into your lungs. It's not the nicotine itself that's very harmful. In fact, it's more or less harmless. But nicotine is important in the cigarette because it's the vehicle that gets people to come back to smoking. And because it's inhaled in the lungs, and the lungs have a very large surface area, it's quickly absorbed. And what happens when it goes into the lungs is it goes to the left side of the heart and then comes shooting up your carotid arteries and into your brain. And it binds here to what's called nicotinic receptors. They're called nicotinic because when people started doing experiments hundreds of years ago, nicotine was found to bind to these types of receptors. So, but it mimics a natural neurotransmitter, binds here, and these neurons project forward to this area here called the nucleus accumbens. It doesn't matter what it's called, except that it does two important things. This is a sort of reward center of our brain. And the first thing it does is, when it fires this nucleus accumbens up, the nucleus accumbens says to the brain, whatever you were doing just then, kind of keep on doing it. And it does it in response to cues or environment. So a lot of people who smoke will smoke in a very stereotyped way. Whenever they're in a certain situation, they'll find themselves reaching for a cigarette without really thinking about it. And that's this habit-driven or associative learning that's going on. And that's a very common experience. And it's an important driver of why people go on smoking. We often call it a smoking habit. It's more than a habit in some ways, but that is an important part of the mechanism. And another part of the nucleus accumbens can give pleasure. Not everyone gets pleasure, as I said, but a number of people do. And obviously enough, if you're a person who smokes and finds smoking pleasurable, you're less likely to want to give up and less likely to try to give up. But then what happens is you keep doing this. So you keep responding. This learning has begun to happen, and the brain changes, a sort of neuroadaptation it's called. But the brain changes in response. So it gets used to a certain level of nicotine intake. And as a result of this, you get this thing called nicotine hunger. When you don't have the nicotine, because you metabolize it quite quickly, you get rid of it by your liver, you create this sensation in your brain that you really need a cigarette. People often experience it as like hunger. They often describe it as it feels visceral to them, in the same way that if you're really hungry, perhaps many of you are now, then you experience that as a sort of visceral sensation, and it's often hard to get past. The next thing that happens is you get a thing called withdrawal. So you get dopamine released in this area here, and that sort of makes you feel good. And when you have this neuroadaptation, you get lower levels of this dopamine release, and you feel worse than normal. And that's what we call withdrawal. And anyone who's seen people, or you yourself have tried to stop smoking, you notice that most people kind of get grumpy and bad-tempered and irritable, right? So that's what's going on with these withdrawal symptoms. Now, I sit on a number of grant-giving committees, so I give out grant awards to other scientists. And I see a lot of things where people want to come along and talk to people about why they smoke, right? So they start off saying, hey, look, there's a group of people, lots of them smoke, so we're going to ask them some questions about why they do it, and then we'll help them stop smoking. If only we could find out why it is. And of course, the problem with that approach is this. All of the action here is going on beneath this bit here. The cerebral cortex is where you do the thinking, the feeling, the talking business. The stuff we're doing now, all of that's going on in that bit of the brain, and there's no action going on here. Whereas pretty much everything that's happening with smoking is going on here beneath consciousness. So talking to people about why they do it, in a sense, doesn't really explain it. And it's why people come along to the clinic and say, I don't understand why I smoke, but I still just do. Because they don't understand it, because it's not to do with that. But that's not to say we don't have a cerebral cortex. Throughout sort of mammalian evolution, at least, all animals have this sort of area, this reward pathway in their brains, highly preserved. It makes us do important things like eat and have sex. But we also are human beings, and we think, and we begin to evolve beliefs about that. And one of those beliefs that comes about is that smoking is a stress reliever. And it's quite an important thought, because if I had £1 for every person I see in the clinic who say, I stopped smoking, I couldn't believe it, I stopped for 6 months, and then something happened, and I was in a bad situation, and I reached for a cigarette, and then I found myself escalating back to regular smoking again. That's a very, very common story. I'm going to talk about that story as the talk goes on. So, the way I like to explain this to people in a clinic is there's a sort of a war going on. This bit of the brain I call the animal bit of the brain, right? We're all animals, but the non-human animal bit of the brain. So the animal bit of the brain is what it does when you go without a cigarette and you're in those particular situations where you normally smoke. It says, I need a cigarette. That sort of feeling bursts itself into consciousness. Normally, you just reach for a cigarette and have one without noticing it, and it wouldn't come into consciousness. But because you've decided to stop smoking, it suddenly becomes a conscious thought. We call it a craving or an urge. And that's what's going on. The animal brain saying, I need it now. And then there's a bit that worries about your life, your health, your money, whatever it is, the reasons you're trying to stop smoking. And you've got this war going on between the animal brain and the human thinking part of the brain. And that's the dilemma that a person has when they try to stop smoking. So we can think of these two sets of forces, the sort of animal force, this urge or craving going up and down in response to situations in your life. And we've got our kind of our good side, the bit that says, I really don't want to have cancer, I really want to give up smoking, it's costing me a lot, and there's all sorts of reasons why you might want to give up smoking. And I've called it here resolve. You're resolved not to do it. You say to yourself, that's not what I'm going to do. And of course, what happens is that if these two cross, as it were, our resolve becomes lower than our kind of need, then, and if cigarettes are around, then a lapse will occur. So and the problem with lapses is they tend to undermine your resolve, for one thing, and the second thing is that they sort of reawaken this process. So this is a learned response to cigarette smoking, and if you stop smoking for a while, this urge thing goes away in time. It goes away on a sort of declining curve. And what we do when we help people to stop smoking in a treatment course is we try to separate these two lines as much as possible. We try to reduce the strength of the urge. And the only way we can really do that is with medication. That's things like nicotine replacement, gum, patches, that kind of thing. But also nowadays we have a couple of medications that we use. One that we don't really use much anymore called Zyban or bupropion. One that we use quite a bit more nowadays called varenicline or Champix. You may have heard of those medicines. But what they do essentially is they reduce the strength of the urge. There was a nice advert a few years ago. It said, gives you willpower a fighting chance. So if we think of this resolve thing as your willpower, I don't think willpower is a good concept, by the way. We can talk about that if you want. But it gives your resolve chance because it keeps these two lines apart. That's what medication does. And then, of course, the other thing that helps people stop smoking is the NHS stop smoking clinics, as an example. And what happens there is people try to boost your motivation. And we often in our culture, we think a lot about motivation. Really we overemphasize it. They don't just try to boost your motivation. They try to give you plans that will make it easier on yourself to stop smoking. For example, avoiding those cues that would otherwise make those urges come along. Or give you strategies to help deal with those urges, for example. But if we just go back to the motivation example, anyone who has seen X Factor on the TV will know that what happens in X Factor is a lot of people will come along to the X Factor show and they say to, Sharon Osbourne, whoever it is, I really want it, I want to make it big. And then when they open their mouth to sing, you realize that wanting it is not always enough. We overemphasize wanting, but there's a lot you can learn about how to stop smoking that will make it easier. So that's part of what we do. Now, so as a result, the lapse doesn't occur. Now this is, we call it a relapse curve taken from one of our trials. And all I want to do is to show you, so this is the unhelpfully called the proportion abstinence. So what this is showing is that early in a quit attempt, lots of smokers go back to smoking. And that's because that thing that happens, if you like, in this, is the urge is at its peak there. So these lines are not as far apart here for many people. In fact, they're the opposite way round. The red line is above the green line. So even though people make a sincere attempt to stop smoking, they go back to smoking within days. So it's this urge thing that is at its peak. And as a result, many quit attempts fail very early on, and then gradually the failure rate drops off. So, and that's, if we were to plot the urge strength or the urge frequency, that's what it would look like. It would look like this sort of high to start with, lower later on. And we can think of, you know, when politicians come to power, they often talk about the first 100 days. You know, the messianic type politicians like Tony Blair would have undoubtedly talked about first 100 days. Well, the first 100 days, I put it here at 90 because that's where the labels were, is a different sort of time. What's happening there when a person stops smoking is that these urges are at their peak and they're gradually dying away. And then, and so what we do there is we do the things with medication, we do the things with going to clinics to try and help you understand what you can do to fight those urges, but they gradually die away to those urges. Not completely, and lots of people have them going on, but for the large majority, they've disappeared. And so treatment stops about there. But then, as I said, and as you can see on this graph, people still go on going back to smoking, even though they've got past, as it were, that stage when everyone was feeling grumpy. And, you know, people are nice and normal and human to live with again, and yet they still go back to smoking. They do in our trials, they do outside of the trials. And so in the second, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first 90 days and more about that sort of second period of how we can help people not go there. So this is just a trial that's going on at the moment, and you don't need to look at all of these boxes and try to read it. But what we do in trials is we get folk and we split them into two. And essentially we do it by tossing a coin. So let's imagine you two were smokers coming along to our clinic. I'd toss a coin and say, oh, right, you get this treatment. Toss a coin, you get the other treatment. Right? So it's random. Call that random. The reason we do that is because it produces two groups that are pretty much the same on average. Not that you two are the same, but there'll be equal numbers of men and women. There'll be equal numbers of people with genes that drive them to smoke versus genes that don't, etc. So all of that sort of thing will be randomly allocated and therefore equal. So that's how we do trials. So we have two groups that have the same likelihood of managing to stop smoking at the beginning of the study. And then we give them two different treatments so that if a difference emerges, we know it's down to the treatment and it's not down to inherent differences between the two groups, because our two groups were equal at the start. So this treatment, we call it preloading here. And what that means, and it may seem unusual to you, is putting a nicotine patch on before you stop smoking. So you actually wear it for 4 weeks. You go around smoking as normal, but wearing a nicotine patch. And obviously you're used to putting a patch, you know, most everyone here I'm sure knows that people put patches on after they stop smoking. You say to me, well, why will that help? And obviously I don't know that it will help because this is a study that's still going on. We've recruited our 1,800 people and now we're following them up. So we're into this phase actually, the 6 and 12-month follow-ups of these 1,800 people to see if it will work. But if we go back to our thing of what's going on, it works on this thing called associative learning, which I said to you was a quite important part of understanding smoking. So do you remember the story of Pavlov's dogs? So Pavlov was the guy who had the dogs, and he noticed that when he fed the dogs, and just before he fed the dogs, I've got a dog, and before I feed my dog, he dribbles. I wish he didn't, but that's what he does. But what Pavlov did was he rang the bell when he fed the dogs. And after a while of doing this, he found that just ringing the bell would make the dog dribble. That's associative learning. And so the bell became a cue. And that's what happens when a person smokes. Situations that they normally smoke in become cues to smoke. And that happens because of a pairing of reward. In the dog's case, the reward was the food. In a person who smokes, it's the nicotine releasing dopamine in this area. So that's the reward that's going on in a person's brain. So that pairing happens. Now when you put a nicotine patch on, it does something, it does something to this area here. We call it desensitizes the nicotine receptors. What it means is it makes them unresponsive. So there's a high level of nicotine all the time because you put the patch on. So when you smoke a cigarette on top of that, it's not going to do anything. The receptors are already kind of, completely full. They're not going to respond to the nicotine in the cigarettes. So a person smokes a cigarette and instead of getting that familiar reward here, they don't get anything from it. And it begins to undo the learning that happens. And what Pavlov discovered, all those, was probably more than 100 years ago now, what he discovered was if he... Oh, that's not a fire alarm, is it? No. What he discovered was if he rang the bell like that and kept ringing it without pairing it with the food, eventually the dogs would stop salivating at the sound of the bell, right? So the learning had disappeared, and that's what happens when a person stops smoking. They go into a situation that they'd normally smoke in, and because they resist the urge to smoke, that urge to smoke eventually dies away. It's no longer paired with a brain reward. And maybe just putting a patch on like this before a person stops smoking is a good way of undoing this and making it easier when it actually comes to the day a person stops, usually called a quit day, to go without cigarettes. That's the theory, and we'll put that to a test. And we'll know in about a year's time whether that works. Okay, so that's just one example of the kind of thing we do which is designed to reduce that sort of urge-driven relapse, the big phase of relapse in a person who tries to stop smoking. Let's now talk about the sort of beyond the 90 days period, the period afterwards, this notion of stress and smoking. So the first picture is perhaps a dated film now, Bridget Jones's Diary. And if you ever have seen it, the film, or read the book, you'll notice that what she did when she had bad days was she smoked more. This is ingrained in people's life. This is a picture of soldiers. When I wanted to find an old-fashioned film, I don't know if you've seen them, the black and white sort of films where somebody has a shock or some terrible thing happens, for example in war, and people give them a cigarette and say, go on, have this, it'll make you feel better. This feeling that smoking is stress relieving is smokers and non-smokers believe it. And I wanted to look at this in our research, and I'm going to tell you about what we've been doing to try and look at it, because I don't think it's true, but I'll explain to you why and then ask you what you think. It's important though, because there's a group of people in our society. Well, this is data on the prevalence of smoking taken from an important study called the Health Survey for England, which happens every year, as you can see. And this is the prevalence of smoking, which was back in the early 90s was towards 30%, 27% or something like this. And it was pretty static until, until a raft of tobacco measures, control measures, started with the Labour government around here, but continued during the coalition government, for example, removing PACS displays. So it's not a party political point on today of all days, but a range of tobacco control measures have driven this prevalence down. So that's what's happening in the general population. But this group here are people with mental health problems. And you can see it's wiggly, and it's wiggly because there aren't all that many of them in a survey, so there's an uncertainty about it. Just like in the opinion polls, they say, oh, plus or minus 3%. But you don't need me to see that it's pretty much flat over that time. So whatever's been happening for us as the general population, where smoking is becoming more common, is not happening for people with mental health disorders. So we're not doing, as it were, right by them. We're not helping those people stop smoking. In fact, someone the other day in one of my trials It was actually a preloading trial. He has schizophrenia. He went off on holiday, forgot his medication, and obviously had a bit of a bender while he was on holiday as well, and had a schizophrenic relapse and returned to the country, put back on medication, all was well, but the psychiatric nurse who was looking after him said, look, you better not stop smoking. That will make things worse for you, make your mental health worse. Don't stop smoking. So this belief that it makes things worse is common. And so in all of these studies, we take this approach, and I just hope you can understand what I'm saying. So imagine we all smoke in this room. We measure our mood today, and we measure it on some questionnaire or other. That's how it's usually done. And we fill it in and we say we're happy, we're sad, we're whatever. And then some time passes on the bottom. And then we reconvene here, let's say in 6 months' time, and we measure our mood again. Now, if we're all smokers, some of us will have stopped smoking in that time, and some of us won't. So here are the people who stopped smoking. We measure their mood, but it doesn't matter. We measure our mood in the same way, whether you stop smoking or not. We just measure it. And what we do is we calculate the change, which is, mathematically speaking, that mood measure minus that mood measure. And so in all the studies I'm going to present to you now, we take the difference between your mood at the end minus your mood at the beginning to sort of see how your mood has changed. Fairly obvious. And we're comparing two groups, people who smoke but then stop with people who smoke and continue. So we're comparing those two groups. I'm going to talk first, just checking the time, about a review we did. This is slightly not quite the chronological order we did these studies, but here's a review. And what a review means is we look for all the evidence that's published already. And some of this was actually hidden away in all sorts of places, but we found 26 studies that had some evidence that had done exactly this. They got mood measured when everyone was smoking, and then they got mood measured when some people had stopped and other people had continued. And that period was at least 6 weeks, and we said it's got to be at least 6 weeks between the two measures. And the reason for that is that thing that I told you about earlier called withdrawal, which is everybody knows you feel kind of grumpy and sad and irritable and anxious and stuff when you stop smoking, but that kind of goes away within about 6 weeks. So that's how we did the study. And these are the results. And this is just how we present data, and I'm not going to talk you through it. But the key thing is each of these studies represents the difference in change of mood. So that's one study here. And that is the estimate of the effect. And this is its kind of uncertainty, statistically expressed. And this is the line of zero difference. And you can see everything's on this line here. I'll show you a more intuitive way of looking at the data in a minute, but I want you to try to understand what it shows, just so you can get a sense of the size of the effect. Now, anyone who's ever plotted data, ever done a science experiment and plotted data, will come up with something like this. It's called a normal curve, sometimes called a Gaussian curve. And what you see, so imagine that I was going to take the height of 100 women in the UK. It turns out the average height, I googled it, seems to be about 5'5" for a woman. And there's a thing called the standard deviation, which is a measure, it's shown on here, look, is a measure of the dispersion, and that's about 2 inches. So what that means is that on average, women are 5'5", but most people aren't average, of course. But most people will be within 5'3" to 5'7", one standard deviation either side of that average. In fact, 70%, if it's normally distributed, 70% of people will be in that range. And of course, there'll be a few people out towards here who are kind of 6 footish, a few people down here who are 5 footish, but not many. And that's what data looks like when you plot it. And we could imagine that this wasn't height now, but it was anxiety. So over here we've got people who are kind of relaxed, pretty much dead. And over here, we've got anxious people, right? So that's what anxiety would look like if we plotted it too. And so what we did was measure this thing called a standardized difference. And let me explain what that means. Suppose, oh, these have moved actually, but suppose that was meant to be sitting here, but I hope they're in the same position as relative to one another. Suppose that was how you were. So we looked previously at depression, right? So let's say this is depression, our mood. So we've got super happy people at this end, super happy people here, super miserable people here, because it's a measure of depression. Right. That is where you might have started on that scale. And if you stop smoking, you move to about there. So it's not a big difference, but that's the size of effect we're talking about. So you've got a bit less depressed as a result of stopping smoking. Well, after stopping smoking. We don't know that it's as a result yet. This is a more intuitive way of putting it, and what we're looking at here is the, as it were, the change. So anxiety, look, in people who continue smoking didn't really change, whereas it went down in people who stopped. Depression didn't really change if you continued and went down, and so on. So that's what that's showing. Here are these different measures, and here are things that are sort of happiness, if you like, quality of life, psychological quality of life, and positive mood. We call it affect for some reason I don't understand. It doesn't really change much in people who continue smoking. It goes up in people who stop smoking. So that's what we found consistently across these studies. And we tried to say, well, you know, I've tried to explain to you that normal curve business, and it's a bit kind of cumbersome. So we looked for other things, and the thing we compared it with was antidepressants, tablets. If you're depressed, your doctor gives you a tablet and says, here, take this, it'll help you. Whether you've got anxiety or depression, tends to give you an antidepressant, and they work to a certain extent. But this effect size, so-called, is bigger than this. So the effect, if that's what it is, and we don't know it is an effect, but if that is the effect, stopping smoking appears better for your mental health than an antidepressant if you're depressed. Right. So we wrote this up and we said, well, here's our hypothesis. We've got a guy who smokes, he stops smoking, and ignore the winking aspect here, that's incidental, it just happens to be a Google image thing. As a result of stopping smoking, he feels happy, right? And then the way that science proceeds is people write into the journal and say, you're wrong, you're rubbish, you've got this wrong. And they said to us, this is a more likely explanation. Here's the explanation that they said. What about this guy? He smokes, he feels happy for some reason, stuff happens, you know, people feel happy. And as a result of feeling happier, he gives up smoking. Maybe that's the explanation. And of course that's a partial or possible explanation for the same phenomenon, that stopping smoking and feeling happier are linked. But it doesn't really explain these results, and I'll tell you why. Some of these studies are the kind of study I explained earlier. Imagine we all smoked and we came back 6 months later. But most of these studies were the kind of studies I actually do, which are trials, where everybody in a stop smoking trial, they join the trial because they want to stop smoking, so they all try to stop. And as a result, therefore, the idea of stopping smoking is not contingent upon what happens to your mood. Not only that, everybody stops smoking right at the beginning of the study. That's what we do. You know, people come along to stop smoking. They, apart from in the preloading trial, we normally ask them to stop smoking there and then, or soon after. So that's the possible explanation, but it doesn't hold water. And there's a third explanation, which is this. You've got a person who smokes, and then something happens that's unrelated, but it causes two things to happen simultaneously. It causes a person to stop smoking, and it causes a person to feel happy. So the two are related because there's a third external cause. Nobody can quite identify what this external cause is, and we found it hard to think of anything that would fit the bill. And furthermore, in the studies that we ourselves have done on this, we have adjusted for these external causes. So things like social class, for example. You could say, well, the kind of people in whom we expect a mood improvement are the kind of people who we expect to stop smoking. So you can measure things that tell you what kind of person you are. The stuff we measure: social class, education, ethnic group, age. All of those things might be related to how mood changes, and they might also be related, and we know that they are, to whether people stop smoking. And when we control for those, we do it in a statistical way, but essentially it removes the effect of those things. We still see the same size effect, if that is what it is, of stopping smoking on beneficial mood changes. So I'm not sure that explanation really holds water. But if I were to talk to a person in my clinic and say to them, you know, what happens, it's wrong, you know, you think that smoking makes you, is a stress reliever, but that's not true. They'll say to me, no, you're wrong. I've never smoked, and that's true. I've never smoked, so how can, you know, a person who has smoked surely is the best testament to this. So we have to come up with an explanation of how come people, sincere, sensible, rational people, believe that smoking is a stress reliever if I'm telling them they're wrong. How can I explain that? And this is the explanation we come up with. I've told you already, and most of you will know, that when you stop smoking, you experience this withdrawal, adverse mood changes. What do you experience actually? You experience low mood, you experience anxiety, you experience irritability. All of those symptoms are a lot like what most of us would call stress, right? That's what stress feels like. And then, if that's what you feel like, and you puff on a cigarette and it's caused by withdrawal, then you're going to feel happier again once you've puffed on a cigarette. So repeated exposure to the discomfort of nicotine withdrawal will lead to people puffing on a cigarette. Now, we actually metabolize nicotine really quickly. Our liver will reduce its concentration in your blood by half within a couple of hours of you having it. And in fact, because it comes up in what's called a bolus up into your brain, it's absorbed and shoots into your brain. After a few minutes of finishing your cigarette, the level in your blood is much lower than it was when it was first hitting your brain. So actually, people experience withdrawal, and we can show this quite soon after stopping smoking on a cigarette. So maybe what's happening is that a person is experiencing lots of episodes of withdrawal through the day. And that's occurring because they are a regular smoker. Once they stop experiencing those, because after a while they've gone without cigarettes, then that sort of feeling of discomfort has disappeared. And that's why they feel better when they stop smoking. That's the explanation. They're misattributing what we would call nicotine withdrawal to stress. That's the theory. But there's a second and competing theory, which a lot of people believe, which is that actually depression, I've used depression, she looks depressed, let's use depression as an example, but mental health problems in general, people are, as it were, missing something. So imagine this is sort of their brain. As a GP, I try to sometimes explain to people, how come you need antidepressants to feel right? Because people feel bad about taking antidepressants, or many people do. And I say, well, you know what, your brain's serotonin levels, we talk, just low. It's inherited. It's not your fault. It's just that they're low. And if you take the antidepressants, which boost your serotonin levels, then that's like you being normal again. So don't feel bad about needing them. That's just kind of the way you are. It's an unlucky brain. And we can say the same about smoking. This is the hypothesis, an alternative idea. to explain it, that when a person smokes, it's as though the cigarette chemicals and cigarettes, and actually they include things that are like antidepressants in the raft of many chemicals that you inhale, are sort of, as it were, completing a person's brain and making them feel whole. And so the reason psychiatric illness and cigarettes are linked is because cigarettes are somehow therapeutic in the way that antidepressants might be therapeutic for people with low serotonin levels. That's the idea. So what would happen if we just is when a person goes without smoking, they feel worse, right? So we have two competing hypotheses. Here's the one that I put to you as my favoured one, the one that we proposed in our research, which is this guy feels average, he stops smoking and he feels better. And as a result of feeling better, he stays off cigarettes. This guy, he feels neutral, he stops smoking, he feels worse because he stopped smoking. That, he's missing something. The thing that cigarettes were giving him, whatever that chemical was, it's gone. And as a result, life just loses its colour. He trudges through life, he feels grumpy and miserable, and he thinks, you know what, it's just not worth it. I'm going back to smoking. I'm going back to, pressing the wrong button. I'm going back to smoking. So people make a reasoned decision. They say, well, okay, I know about cancer and heart disease, but I just feel miserable. I'm going back to smoking. So we wanted to test the idea. Could this explain it? On the one hand, we said to people, look, if you stop smoking, you'll feel better. But could it be that there's a group of people for whom that's true and a group of people for whom that's not true? The reverse is true. And the reason, it's no good. We can tell these folks, stop smoking, you'll feel better, your mood will improve, till we're blue in the face. But it's not true for them. Could that be the explanation? So we've got some data from a pharmaceutical company that I'd worked with. That's one of the benefits of working with a company. You have a relationship, you can talk to them. And they sent us these 5 trials that we put together. And in these trials, people were not trying to stop smoking, they were actually cutting down. And what happened was they were seen over the course at least of 12 months. In fact, some of them were longer, but we'll talk about the first 12 months. And so everybody joined this trial and nobody wanted to stop smoking. That was a condition of joining the study. But some of them do. That's what people do. Some people stop smoking. So 4 months later, a smallish group of people had stopped smoking. And some of them, their mood had improved. Some of them, their mood had got worse. Now, it could just be because, life has happened and the mood improvers, as it were, life's just better now than it was 4 months ago. But the mood worseners, life is just worse. But it could be that that's because they've all stopped smoking. And their life has got better because they've stopped smoking. And their life has got worse because they've stopped smoking. It's that one effect, the offset effect of missing your chemicals down here versus the getting rid of your multiple periods of withdrawal here. Maybe that's happening. So this is what we're testing. And what we did was we said, now what's going to happen at 12 months? Are these guys going to stay to be abstinent? I've got another thing to appear. Are these guys going to stay abstinent for all this time? And are these guys going to relapse? Are they going to go back to smoking because they're just feeling miserable? And we looked at that and we absolutely found no difference in the relapse rates. Yes, some of them relapsed, but there was no difference between them. And this, I think, also helps to illustrate what I've been saying. This is from one of our studies again, and let me try and explain what this graph shows. We're looking here at what's called a case. It's a slightly odd term, but what it means is the only way you can diagnose, it happens to be measuring anxiety. The only way you can diagnose a person with an anxiety disorder is for a doctor or a psychiatrist or psychologist or something to examine a person and say, oh yes, you've got all the symptoms of an anxiety disorder and it's bad enough, we count it as a disorder. But you can't do that in a study because in this study there was 600 and something people, and you can't have a psychiatrist examine 600 and something people. So we gave them a questionnaire. So these people are scoring high enough on the questionnaire that they score the same as somebody who has a diagnosed anxiety disorder would score, if that makes sense. So they've probably got an anxiety disorder, we can't be sure, but that's really what it means. And at the beginning of the study, this is what baseline means, the beginning of the study, we asked them a number of questions. One question was, do you smoke mainly for enjoyment, or mainly to cope with stress, or a bit of both? And of those people who said they smoked to cope with stress, I'm going to talk about 100 people. 50 out of 100 people who said they smoked to cope with stress had anxiety such that we would normally expect them to have an anxiety disorder. 50 and 100. Amongst the whole sample, it was 15 and 100 had anxiety such that they would have an anxiety disorder. That's quite a high level for the general population, but not high for people who smoke, who are, as I've already told you, much more likely to have a psychological illness. And we have people with psychiatric disorders diagnosed and on treatment, and about 27 and 100 of them had severe anxiety such that they would represent a case. And then they stopped smoking, and we're only looking at the people who stopped smoking here. So this is 50 and 100 of people. Once we followed them up 6 months later, only 10 in 100 of those people had an anxiety disorder. So 40 in 100 had got better. And if you look, the effect, and it's true in the general sample, so 15 in 100 goes down to 10 in 100. But in the people who have the smoke to cope, I smoke mainly to cope with stress, they get much the biggest reduction in anxiety as a result of stopping smoking. So it's the people who believe most strongly that smoking is therapeutic for them that get the biggest benefit when they stop. And I think that, for me, I feel it's more persuasive that this is a real effect of stopping smoking, that they're misattributing what essentially cigarettes are doing to them as stress, and cigarettes relieving that as stress relief. So, that's not proof. The only way you can prove something is to do these planned experiments. You know now, I've explained to you about randomization, the toss the coin experiment, half the people. And here's a study that we could do. We could get people with depression, for example, and we randomize them to smoke or not to smoke. Now, of all the reasons people have, either to go on smoking or to stop smoking, pleasing experimenters is not the most cogent one for them to behave in the way that we ask them. So this study, as you can imagine, is not likely to happen, nor is it perhaps ethical to ask people to go on smoking. But we can do the opposite of telling people to go on smoking. We can give these people help to stop. So if we take people in treatment for depression, and this is what we're planning to do now, take people in treatment who are actively being treated for depression and say to them, listen, we think this will make your depression better if you stop smoking. Everyone has to smoke, people with depression and who smoke. This will make you better, and here's how, and it gives them some treatment. And we measure mood at the study end. If we find that mood is better in this group than this group, then we'll be able to conclude for sure that it's the stopping smoking that improves it. But until we do that study, we won't know for sure. So we're at the end now. So what can we conclude? Well, most people who smoke, who go on smoking, are addicted to a greater or lesser extent. And that's why when they try to stop smoking, it's hard. Even people who are not daily smokers, most of their quit attempts fail. And that's because They go to situations where they normally smoke, and the same process that happens in a, heavy smoker happens. Not usually with the same intensity, but it happens. But even when people are past all that business of the urge and the cravings and the withdrawal, they still go back to smoking. And it seems that stress relief and the belief that smoking is a stress reliever is important in explaining that. But I don't think that belief is actually sound. And I think the evidence, in fact, shows the opposite. But I would be interested to hear your views. Thank you very much.